Hi guys, so today I want to talk about the close Sicilian setup against the Sicilian defense. So if you're wondering, what do I do against e4 and c5 for white? Should I play for the open Sicilian, where usually I'm gonna castle queenside and try to attack their king? Or do I play something quieter, like maybe the Alapin variation after c5 and c3 and try to take the center with my pawns? And play a different type of game? Well, there is a third option, and that's the closed Sicilian for you. So let's say they play e4, c5, and we play knight c3. So no matter what they do afterwards, there is the Grand Prix attack with f4, but I personally prefer g3 better, and we'll see some of the attacking ideas that arise out of g3, which is the real closed Sicilian. So we're gonna fianchetto our king's bishop and play for a kingside attack and essential spatial advantage. So no matter what they do, our pieces come to roughly the same squares, which are basically bishop to g2, pawn to d3, bishop to e3, queen to d2, knight to e2. We're gonna castle the king short or long, depending on what they decide to do with their pieces, and then we're gonna play rook to e1, getting ready for pushing those f and e pawns, which will open the way for our rooks. And so now we're gonna see a few of the attacking plans for black, which will demonstrate also what white is supposed to do against different black setups. So for example, black can try to go for g6, or black can try to go for e6. So how do we attack those black setups basically if you're playing the closed Sicilian? So first, let's start off with g6 and let's see what they will usually play. So usually they'll play something like bishop g7. We continue with the setup basically no matter what they do. So pawn to d3, no matter what they do, they take out their pawns, we take out our bishop, and the bishop plus queen comes out before the knight. And the reason why is we're not sure about where the knight wants to go yet. Sometimes we want to play knight e2, sometimes knight f3, sometimes knight h3, because each one of those has their own ideas. But the bishop we're sure about, because it's definitely coming out to e3, making way for the battery with the queen, so as to trade up the bishop later on in most variations, if we're given the chance, of course. So then sometimes if the knight comes to f6, we have to make sure the knight can't come to g4, especially if the pawn's on e7 or e5. So then we play h3. The simple way to remember it is that if the knight comes to f6, we play h3 no matter what, right? But let's say they play with this pawn on e6 and they try to go for a type of closed Sicilian of their own, where they're going to control the d4 square, and I'm going to show you why that's not so scary, because we can always kick out this knight later on. Okay, so let's say they play pawn to e6, we take out our queen, and they play knight to e7. So they're preparing to castle, and I'll ask them a little question about their bishop. In particular, how are you gonna defend it? Do you want to trade off my bishop so that my queen can come and bother your king? Or maybe you want to castle right into my kingside attack. And this is the first idea I want you guys to remember, which is simply trade off the best defender of the king and then push for h4, h5, opening up the h-file and then checkmating the poor king later on. Let's say the knight comes in the middle, hoping for some trick like bishop takes, queen takes, and then he'll get to fork me. Well, I don't have to be too scared, because at this point I can take myself and then push for h5. This is almost like a dragon idea, where we trade off the good dragon bishop and start pushing the pawn. Unlike in the dragon, our king is completely safe and nothing's ever gonna happen to him, because he's not even committed to any side yet. He can still castle long, he can stay in the middle, or in some cases he castles short anyways. But our idea is very clear. No matter what they do and what kind of pawn storm they try, we're just coming in for the king. And the poor king doesn't have much of a choice, because I'll checkmate him on h8, or if he decides to take a little walk, well, for example, one way to finish off the game is knight check and bishop checkmate. So that's what can happen if we just follow the closed Sicilian setup and trade off their dark square bishop. The second thing to keep in mind is what if they put the knight on f6 this time, or if they keep him at home. Well, let's take a look at what happens if he comes to f6, right? So first, they take out the c6 knight. We follow the close Sicilian blueprint, the setup, and they do the same. So pawn to g6, bishop g2, bishop g7, pawn to d3, and they're gonna follow a dragon-like structure. So they're gonna try to get the knight to f6 to castle short, to bring the knight to d7, and then eventually to start pushing on the queen side. But as I always say, they're attacking pawns and we're attacking the king. So guess who'll win, right? And so let's take a look at how it may look like. We play something like bishop to e3, they play knight to f6. Okay, good for them. They're playing it like a dragon. So most dragon players will actually try this against the close Sicilian. So then we put the pawn on h3 and say, nope, you're not coming here because I'm not gonna let you. And right away they're probably gonna castle, and we're still gonna play the queen to d2 because that's still where the queen belongs. Let's say they prepare the pawns turn with something like rook b8, because eventually they do want to get the pawns rolling, especially if we castle long, which we're not gonna do anymore, because against knight f6, the knight is more centralized, the knight is keeping an eye on the king, so I'm not as excited about h4, h5, although you can still try it, but it's not as good in my opinion. That's why we play for the classical attacking style. The first thing we do is we're just gonna trade off their best friend, the bishop. And no matter what they do, we're gonna trade, and push for f4. They can put the beautiful knight on d4, I really don't mind, because later I'm gonna just play knight d1 whether they ask me or not, because I want to go here anyways. And then no matter what they do, perhaps they take out their queen to b6, I'm just gonna kick back the knight, ask him where he's going, and if he comes back to c6 where he came from, then I'm gonna put the beautiful knight on e3 with his friend on f3 as well. Let's say they take out the bishop somewhere. Okay, and knight to f3. So then they try to open up the b file. Well, first of all, I'm not too scared because I always have knight c4. But second of all, I'm not gonna push the pawn in, at least not always, because then that gives them the d4 square again, which we're not completely sure about. Even though it is an idea, I would try to just play something like knight c4, kick away the queen, and then castle short. So then our idea is very simple. Push the g and f pawns, kicking away everybody in our way, right? So let's say they open up the highway, that's okay. We don't really mind much. Let's say they try pushing the pawns and try to get the pawn to a3 and then try to get the b2 square. Well, first of all, the knight's gonna stop that, so we're really not too scared about that. They have very little in terms of plans for how to attack the white queen side. Well, our plan is very simple. We're just gonna play something like g4. We're gonna play f5. And then very soon, we're going to double up on the f file, bringing all the attackers in play. And then start going for either g5, f6, kicking away their knight. Or try to get the knight to somewhere like g4 so that the queen can get the h6 square, perhaps even playing something like f5, g5, queen f4, queen h4, queen h6, and I'm coming for the king who's feeling very lonely without his dragon bishop, and the good knight on f6 when he'll get kicked back. So that's the main thing to keep in mind, and I want to show one more variation, one more idea for you guys about how to attack. So let's say they play c5, we play knight c3, and they try to play for this a6 b5 push right away. So almost like a Poulsen setup in the open Sicilian, but here I don't think it's as good for black, and we'll see why in a few seconds. So we start off with pawn to g3. Let's say they play pawn to e6, so they're playing it like a Khan Sicilian almost, with the pawns on a6 and e6. That's okay, we just continue with our development, bishop to g2, and they're gonna play for pawn b5. One idea to always keep in mind is if I can just push the pawn. Now, it's not always good because pawn to e5, knight to c6, it's not fantastic, because unless I win something on this diagonal, this pawn turns out to be overextended, and then they can trade it off. So instead of overextending the pawn, Another good idea is just to continue development. Just let them take out their pieces however they like. But because the bishop is on this diagonal now, I like this idea. So we break the potential pin on the pawn, and we're actually going for another idea. So the other idea is this. We're gonna play for a4. We're gonna provoke b4 because otherwise I was simply winning this pawn, and if they take on a4, that's fantastic, right? Because then we have this open half open highway, this pawn on a6 that's gonna be weak for the rest of its natural life, and also they don't have much of an attacking plan against my b file because then I can always play b3 myself. So then most people, they'll push the pawn because they want to keep the pawns flowing naturally, but that's okay because my knight wants to come to the king side. I want to gather everybody in one fist that's coming for the black king. All my soldiers are coming to surround him. So let's see how that can turn out, right? Let's say they play some natural move like bishop e7. Okay, that's fine. Castle. And let's say they take out the bishop, and I'm gonna close down the queen side right away. Here it makes some sense because now they have no way to open this up again. They have no breakthroughs, and I'm just gonna close it up. Even if they take en passant, we're gonna take this way and play for rook to b1. So for example, something like c4 trying to attack my center, they're still underdeveloped and not castles. So I'm not scared about them opening up my center. But first I'll include something like rook to b1. So then if he takes, I'll take on b7, they take on e2, and I'm very happy with white's position here. It's almost winning, I would say, considering white has the bishop pair, the king is still not castled, and black has this backwards d6 pawn with a rook on the 7th rank. So guys, hopefully you remember those three ways of attacking. So because the bishop came to b7, I want to put the knight at 2f3, but usually the knight comes to e2. So remember that, and the bishops and queen come out before the knight because we're not sure about the knight. We're gonna consider f4, h3, and g4 with the pawn storm on the king side, or we're gonna trade off the dark square bishop on g7 by playing something like bishop e3, queen d2, and bishop h6, weakening the black king side if they ever play for g6. Hopefully you can use this setup in your games, and I want to also make another video showing an example of how a closed Sicilian will look like, so that's coming soon.